Has Britain, kind of for the first time since the invasion of Ukraine, suddenly reversed the severity of our sanctions regime? It's a big question. It's somewhat complex, but I'm going to take you through all of this in the coming minutes. But we're going to start in a slightly unexpected place, which is to ask this question, what's the background to this? And part of the background to this is Britain is really reliant on imports of various different types of fuels, but it kind of depends on the type of fuel. And that's all because the refineries in this country are set up to make particular types of things. So we've got actually a lot of capacity in this country to make petrol. And as a result of that, the amount of petrol we're making is above the amount of petrol we need. And that's all this chart is showing you. The higher the line is, the more kind of self-sufficient we are. And that point there, kind of zero, is where we start to depend on imports. So petrol, going back for the last few years, always been pretty kind of self-sufficient in that. Diesel, a different story. So we used to be pretty self-sufficient for diesel, but over the years, as you've had more diesel cars and as we've had more refineries shutting down, which is critical as well, we've become more dependent on imported diesel. But here's another critical thing. Jet fuel, we have always been really dependent on imports. As I say, it's just partly due to the nature of the refining system in this country. And we've got more and more dependent as time has gone by. And in fact, just to give you a sense of how dependent we're talking about, so that's showing us over time and our kind of degree of dependency. If you compare other countries around the world and just the sheer amounts in terms of tons of imports of jet fuel, look at the country that is right at the top. So Britain is the most dependent on jet fuel imports of any country in the world. So we're the most exposed right now. And of course, that raises the question, where does that jet fuel actually come from? And historically, most of it has come from the Gulf. OK, so here we are at the moment. These are just in the past year, the places where we get most of our jet fuel from. And look, you can probably see, I'll kind of highlight them so you can see the pattern here. The majority of it, so there's Kuwait, there's Saudi Arabia, there's the UAE. 60% of it comes from the Middle East. And of course, where are we at the moment? We're in a situation where you can't get most of that jet fuel out of the Middle East because the Strait of Hormuz is closed. And therefore, we can kind of put that into transparent and ask the question, OK, if we can't get that stuff, where are we going to get it from? And here's where things get kind of interesting. And we will get back to those sanctions. You'll see how this all ties in a moment, because it's worth talking for a moment about this, India, which has become a country which we've become more and more dependent on to get our jet fuel in recent years. Also diesel, more and more of it coming out of India. And it's worth saying that wasn't always the case. If you just look back, and this you'll see, this is where it all ties in. If you look back a few years, certainly not the biggest, but one of the places we got a lot of diesel, certainly, and also quite a bit of jet fuel from, was Russia. And then, of course, you have the invasion of Ukraine, and that's when we imposed sanctions on Russia. And all of a sudden, you can see our imports from Russia go down to basically zero. But look at India. This is showing you, again, our imports of jet fuel from India back to 2015. And at that moment that Ukraine has invaded, look at what happens to Indian imports from India of jet fuel. You can see how they go sharply higher. They go sharply higher. And it's worth asking the question, what's going on behind the scenes there? By the way, if you just look, and there's another way of kind of looking at this, this is just showing you that's what we were getting from India, not just in terms of jet fuel, but also diesel and other things. So not all that much before the invasion of Ukraine. Then Russia invades Ukraine. The sanctions, we impose those sanctions on Russia. And look, a big shift. So we're getting a lot more diesel. We're getting a lot more jet fuel in particular. That's the black bits there from India. And what's going on here, not all of it, but certainly a lot of oil that was otherwise going to the EU, and I'll show you that in a second, that was otherwise going to the EU before the invasion. Now, a lot of that oil has been going to India. OK, so it's been going to India. And what happens in India, obviously, the crude oil arrives and it gets refined, and it gets refined in big refineries like this. This is actually the biggest refinery in the world, in Gujarat. So you have the refining happening, a lot of it happening here in India. Like I say, some of the biggest refineries in the world, extraordinary places. And then once it gets processed in those refineries, then it gets shipped out around the world, including to places like the UK. Now, you can ask the question, OK, if some of that, quite a big proportion of that, originally started as Russian oil, is that us importing stuff from Russia, albeit indirectly? Well, I think that's a legitimate question. And this is showing you where Britain has got its jet fuel from India. Actually, it's all oil products from India in the past. And how much of that, this is the red bit, how much of that potentially came from Russia originally? The molecules started in Russia. And we've been asking the question for quite a long time. You know, what does this say about the sanctions regime? Does it say that, you know, instead of actually stopping Russia from getting the revenue it needs from that oil, we're just shifting around the global system and allowing other countries to basically launder that oil, but still a lot of the revenues end up in Russia? And you can make the case, this is showing you where Russian oil used to go before the invasion of Ukraine, most of it to the EU, then China, and India quite a long way down. I'll highlight India in green. You can make the case, instead of kind of freezing out Russia, you've just changed the geography of the global oil system. Look at India there. That's before the invasion of Ukraine. And look at where it goes more recently. Now, we've gone to a system where the EU is basically down at zero. Russia's still exporting loads of oil, but most of it's going to China and to India. And we've been making that case for quite some time here on Sky News. We've been making the case that it's not just jet fuel. If you look at liquefied natural gas, a lot of that is still going to the EU. And we've been asking the question, is the sanctions regime actually as tough as the politicians have been saying? And here's where we get back to that question, because interestingly, just last October, the government came out and they said, OK, we've listened to a lot of these concerns and we're changing things. We're going to tighten the implication. We're going to tighten all of the restrictions on liquefied natural gas going around Europe. We're going to make it so that, look at this, UK ramps up sanctions. This was just in October. We're going to make it so that, I'll zoom in so you can see, so that we will be imposing restrictions on imports of products refined in third countries from Russian origin crude oil. In other words, this is the clause that says we are worried about all of that Indian oil, not just India, some from Turkey as well, but particularly Indian oil, and we're not going to take it in the future. So that's what they said. But then, of course, we all know what's happened next. We've had the events in the Middle East. You've had the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. You have big concern in this country, look over there, that we don't have enough stocks of jet fuel. And of course, we're really dependent on imports. And you've seen what's happening in the market for holidays at the moment and for flights. Flights are being cancelled across the UK, and the government is very concerned about what's going to happen in the future. Does that trump what's happening in Ukraine? Does that trump the sanctions regime? Well, that's the question worth pondering, because we just had, in the past 24 hours, this. I mean, it will look complex, but actually it's quite simple. Basically, it's saying, it's a general trade license, and I'll highlight the bit that matters here. It's saying that there are certain items that the Russian regulations do not apply to, particular things. So the sanctions don't apply to particular things. And what are those things that the sanctions apply to? It's to jet fuel and diesel that have come via third countries. In other words, precisely that thing I showed you a moment ago that they were going to clamp down on, they're now saying, at least for diesel and for jet fuel, we're not going to be doing that. And you know the reason why, because you've seen those charts. You've seen how dependent Britain is on that stuff. You've seen how much of that comes from places like India, originally starting as molecules that began coming out of the ground in Russia. But here's why this really matters. This is showing you how much money the Russian government, so the Kremlin, is making from oil. It's just the revenues coming into their coffers from oil and gas. And up until quite recently, so February of this year, they've been coming down. So it was doing worse and worse and really struggling as a result, making less and less money, getting down to the lowest level in 6 years. But you probably know where this is heading right now. I mean, those numbers, by the way, are very kind of correlated with what's happening to the oil price. So that line is the oil price. The blue bars are how much money they're making from it in the Kremlin. And that is what happened to the oil price later when we saw the events in the Middle East. And lo and behold, the Kremlin has really started to make a lot of money just in the last few months. So that's the latest month for which we have data for. And it is now starting to make the most money it has in 2 years. And that is before these changes to the sanctions regime have actually kicked in. All of which is to say, this stuff matters. And, you know, it's a complex issue. And the government's approach to it is complex. But it does look like a softening of our sanctions regime, really for the first time since 2022.